Welcome to History Teller YT, where the forgotten voices of the past rise again, and where every fire, every battle, every triumph becomes a living experience. Today, I'm taking you into one of the most dramatic, devastating, and transformative events in American history, the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. This is not just the story of flames that devoured a city. It's the story of people, ordinary residents, immigrants, families, workers, whose lives were changed forever in a single night. It's the story of a rising American metropolis brought to its knees, and of the extraordinary determination that rebuilt it stronger than ever. In this full documentary, you will hear how a spark in a small barn turned into a wall of fire that swallowed everything in its path, destroying homes, factories, railroads, churches, schools, an entire world reduced to ashes. You'll journey through the terror of the fire's advance, the chaos of evacuations, the collapse of buildings, the heroism of firefighters who fought with empty hoses, and the desperate struggle for survival as families fled to the freezing lakefront. But that is only the beginning. You'll witness how Chicago rose again with breathtaking speed, led by immigrants, laborers, architects, visionaries, and dreamers. You'll learn how new building codes, modern engineering, advanced fire safety, skyscraper innovation, and revolutionary urban planning were all born from this tragedy. You will see the rise of public libraries, schools, hospitals, social reforms, sanitation systems, political battles, labor movements, architecture legends, and the birth of the modern skyscraper, all sparked by the lessons of the fire. You'll discover how Chicago transformed its identity, challenged rival cities like New York and Boston, and prepared itself to host the world's Columbian Exposition of 1893, stunning the entire world with a new vision of what a city could be. This is a story of loss and courage, of tragedy and rebirth, of a city that refused to die. By the time you finish this documentary, you won't just know the history of the Great Chicago Fire. You'll feel it. So sit back, open your heart, and step into the burning night of 1871. Because the flames that once destroyed Chicago also forged an unbreakable American spirit. This is History Teller YT. In the decades leading up to 1871, Chicago transformed from a marsh-lined frontier outpost into one of the most rapidly expanding cities in the United States. Its location on the southwestern shore of Lake Michigan was not just a geographical convenience. It was the beating heart of the city's promise. Railroads radiated from Chicago like spokes on a wheel, linking the eastern seaboard with the raw materials of the American West. Grain, lumber, livestock, and manufactured goods found their way through Chicago's depots and rail yards in such staggering quantities that the city became the central transfer point of the American interior. Its population reflected this explosive growth, from around 4,000 residents in 1837, when the city was officially incorporated, to over 300,000 by 1871. Every immigrant, speculator, merchant, and laborer who stepped onto Chicago's streets saw a place of opportunity. But they also unknowingly stepped into a city whose speed of development far outpaced its safety measures. Chicago's architecture was a physical manifestation of this rush toward prosperity. Wooden homes, wooden sidewalks, wooden streets, and even wooden roofing shingles dominated the landscape. Building codes were minimal, enforcement was inconsistent, and carpenters worked at frantic speed to keep up with demand. Lumberyards lined the river, stacked high with boards and beams that dried into tinder under the intense summer sun. The economy rewarded expansion, not caution, and thus the city grew in a way that was both impressive and precarious. Even the proud downtown business district, filled with imposing commercial blocks, relied heavily on wood. Some structures were clad in stone or brick, but their interiors remained flammable. This created a situation where one spark, under the right conditions, could leap from rooftop to rooftop and ignite disaster. Weather conditions during the months preceding the fire exacerbated Chicago's vulnerability. The summer of 1871 had been extraordinarily dry. Rainfall was scarce, leaving grasslands, timber piles, and building materials desiccated. A drought of this severity turned the city into a powder keg. Newspapers occasionally warned residents to take care around open flames, but at a time when candles, kerosene lamps, and wood-burning stoves were used daily, avoiding fire entirely was impossible. Adding to the danger were strong autumn winds, which often whipped through Chicago's grid-like streets, funneled by buildings that created wind tunnels perfect for feeding flames. While residents went about their routines, working in stockyards, shopping in markets, conversing in saloons, they did so beneath an invisible threat, unaware that the fuse had been laid beneath their very feet. By early October, the city had already suffered several smaller fires. On Saturday, October 7th, a blaze tore through parts of the South Division, requiring such an intense firefighting effort that crews were left exhausted and equipment was badly damaged. Fire Chief Robert Williams warned city officials that his department was overstretched and dangerously fatigued, but there was little anyone could do in the face of Chicago's relentless daily needs. As Sunday, October 8th approached, Chicago was not a city waiting for disaster. It was a city unknowingly courting it. The stage was set. The buildings were dry. The winds were high. The firefighters were weary, and the conditions were primed for a catastrophe that would etch itself permanently into American history. Chicago's meteoric rise had not been a clean or even transformation. Beneath the veneer of prosperity lay profound social divides. Immigrant communities, Irish, German, Scandinavian, and increasingly Eastern European groups, clustered into tight neighborhoods where wages were low and housing was haphazardly built. Many worked in brutal industrial jobs in factories, slaughterhouses, or railroad yards, where long hours and dangerous conditions were the norm. Despite hardship, these communities contributed immensely to the city's booming economy. Their labor built Chicago's infrastructure, filled its warehouses, and sustained its expanding trade networks. Yet the city's rapid growth meant that civic planning and public safety measures lagged far behind, creating overcrowded districts full of wooden homes spaced so closely that one fire could threaten thousands. Elite Chicagoans, by contrast, lived in more fashionable areas with wider streets, sturdier buildings, and better access to services. Mansions along Prairie Avenue or near the downtown core reflected the wealth produced by commerce and speculation. These upper-class citizens viewed the city as a triumph of American ingenuity, a testament to the possibilities of capitalism and industry. Yet even they sensed the city's fragility. Fire was an omnipresent fear, and insurance companies kept close watch on the growing risks. As more lumberyards were built near residential blocks, some warned that disaster was inevitable if the city failed to impose stricter regulations. But Chicago's political structure was heavily influenced by business interests. Maintaining growth often mattered more than preparing for emergencies. Beyond economic divisions, there was an undercurrent of cultural tension. Newspapers sometimes stoked resentment, portraying immigrant districts as chaotic, poorly managed, or morally questionable. Saloons, boarding houses, and factories operated side by side in dense clusters, creating noise, pollution, and fire hazards. But these areas were also centers of community, where neighbors helped each other, shared resources, and upheld traditions from their homelands. The city government rarely intervened to improve conditions. Instead, It relied on volunteer efforts or private charities. This lack of oversight contributed to environments where safety standards were improvised and building practices varied widely in quality. Chicago's fire department, though staffed by dedicated professionals, was outmatched by the scale and speed of the city's growth. With just 185 firefighters and 17 steam-powered engines to protect a metropolis of 300,000, the force was perpetually stretched thin. Communication systems were rudimentary. Fire alarms were manually operated through telegraph boxes scattered around the city, and errors in reporting were common. Streets were often muddy or obstructed, slowing response times. Water pressure fluctuated, and hydrants could be unreliable. In short, though the firefighters were courageous, the infrastructure supporting them was fragile. These social and structural vulnerabilities interwove into a tapestry of risk. Ordinary citizens understood that fire was a threat. The odor of smoke was a familiar part of city life, but they generally believed that skilled firemen or divine providence would protect them. Few imagined that a single blaze could overwhelm the entire urban system. Yet by October 1871, the city's weaknesses were so deep that even a small spark in the wrong place at the wrong time could unleash devastation. Chicago was not simply unlucky when the fire began. It was the result of decades of imbalance. Growth without regulation, ambition without caution, and hope without preparation. As Sunday evening approached, these buried tensions were about to erupt in the form of flames that would reshape not only the city, but the nation's understanding of urban safety and resilience. In the heart of Chicago's West Side lay a modest neighborhood of working-class families, many of them Irish immigrants seeking stability in a city that promised opportunity. Among them lived Catherine and Patrick O'Leary, whose quiet life would become the focal point of one of the most persistent myths in American folklore. Their home at 137 DeCoven Street stood in a district characterized by small wooden houses, barns, sheds, and outbuildings packed closely together. Livestock, especially cows and horses, were commonly kept on private property, as families relied on them for milk or transportation. This combination of wooden structures, dry conditions, and combustible materials created a particularly dangerous environment. Though few residents thought of their neighborhood as unusual, it resembled many other working-class districts throughout the city. Catherine O'Leary, who would later be wrongfully immortalized in song and newspaper caricature, was a hard-working woman known to keep to herself. The myth that her cow kicked over a lantern, igniting the fire, emerged within days of the disaster, fueled largely by sensationalist journalism and anti-Irish prejudice. Reporters, desperate for a gripping narrative, seized on the image of an Irish woman tending to her rebellious cow late at night. The story was both dramatic and conveniently aligned with existing stereotypes. Yet no credible evidence ever supported the tale. In fact, investigators at the time concluded that the exact cause of the fire could not be determined. Later historians would reaffirm that blaming the O'Learys was unjust and unsupported. Yet the myth endured in popular culture for more than a century. The neighborhood itself was a vivid example of the structural dangers facing Chicago. Barns filled with hay, wooden fences, and aging sheds created a maze of flammable material. The ground was dry, the air was warm, and the winds were strong. People went about their routines, tending to animals, cooking meals, lighting lamps, without any sense that catastrophe was imminent. On the night of October 8th, the O'Learys and their neighbors settled into their typical Sunday evening rhythms. Some attended church, others entertained guests, and many rested after a long week of labor. In the O'Leary barn, cows were kept for milk production, and tools or feed were stored nearby. The presence of lanterns or lamps would not have been unusual, as these were essential for nighttime tasks. While the precise ignition point remains unknown, historians agree that the environment was so primed for combustion that almost any spark, whether from a lantern, a careless pipe ember, a dropped match, or even spontaneous ignition of hay, could have started the blaze. What mattered most was not the origin, but the conditions that allowed the fire to grow with unprecedented speed. Within minutes of its appearance, flames leapt from one structure to the next, propelled by winds that scattered burning embers across rooftops. Neighbors rushed to alert authorities, but errors in the fire alarm system delayed the arrival of the nearest brigade. This initial delay proved costly, allowing the fire to gather strength before firefighters could attempt containment. The unfair treatment of the O'Leary family in the aftermath of the fire reflected deeper societal attitudes of the period. Immigrant communities, especially the Irish, were frequently scapegoated for urban problems. Blaming the disaster on a simple, memorable image, a cow, a lantern, and a reckless moment, allowed the public to avoid confronting the much more uncomfortable truth. Chicago's leadership had allowed a tinderbox city to flourish without adequate protection. While the O'Learys suffered ridicule and defamation, the larger systemic failures went largely unaddressed until after the fire forced the city to reckon with them. By understanding the myth and its origins, we gain insight not only into the biases of the time, but also into how societies often seek simple answers to complex failures. The first moments of the Great Chicago Fire were defined not only by flames, but by a crucial sequence of human errors that allowed a small blaze to transform into a city-wide catastrophe. At around 9 p.m. on the night of October 8th, 1871, neighbors near the O'Leary property noticed the unmistakable glow of fire rising from the barn. Their reaction was immediate. Several residents sprinted to the closest fire alarm box to summon help. Chicago's alarm system relied on a network of telegraph boxes that transmitted signals to the central fire headquarters, where dispatchers then directed nearby engines. However, this system, while advanced for its time, was vulnerable to misjudgments and technical flaws. The dispatcher on duty that night, likely fatigued from the previous day's massive fire on October 7th, mistakenly sent the first response team to the wrong location, several blocks away from the actual fire. This early misrouting cost the city precious minutes during a night when seconds mattered. As the flames expanded, witnesses later described them as moving with unnatural speed, almost as if alive. The barn and nearby outbuildings were engulfed in minutes. The extreme dryness of the season had turned every wooden surface into ready fuel, and the southwesterly winds fanned the fire like a bellows. When the first fire engines finally approached the correct area, they were already facing a blaze that had grown into a roaring inferno. Fire Chief Robert Williams arrived quickly, but even he was shocked by the intensity. The exhausted crews, still recovering from the previous day's extensive firefighting, worked valiantly to set up hoses, but water pressure in the nearby hydrants fluctuated. This inconsistency was a chronic issue in Chicago's rapidly expanding neighborhoods, where infrastructure often lagged behind population growth. The situation worsened when burning debris, lifted by powerful gusts, began raining down onto nearby roofs. Wooden shingles, dry as parchment, ignited upon contact. One roof after another caught fire, creating a series of rapidly spreading satellite blazes. Firefighters could no longer focus on a single origin point. They were confronted with multiple fronts that grew out of their control. They attempted to cut fire breaks by demolishing structures, but the tools and manpower required for such drastic measures were limited. Meanwhile, onlookers gathered in the streets, some in shock, others attempting to move belongings before the flames reached their homes. Their presence unintentionally hindered the movement of the fire engines, clogging narrow roads and forcing crews to navigate through human congestion. This unfolding chaos made one thing painfully clear. The city's systems, its communications, its water infrastructure, and its fire department were completely unprepared for a crisis of this magnitude. The initial miscommunication was not the sole cause of the disaster, but it served as the spark that allowed an already dangerous fire to bloom into an unstoppable force. Chicago, a city confident in its modernity and progress, was about to confront a truth more devastating than any flame: that its rapid rise had come without the safeguards necessary to protect its people. As the fire grew beyond the reach of the first responders, Chicago's fate began to shift irreversibly from manageable emergency to imminent catastrophe. By 10 p.m., what had begun as a localized neighborhood fire was transforming into an event that defied the expectations of even the most experienced firefighters. The South Branch of the Chicago River, which many assumed would act as a natural barrier, failed spectacularly in its role as a fire break. The winds that night were so fierce that burning embers traveled across the water like fiery missiles, landing on lumber yards, coal piles, and riverside warehouses on the opposite bank. These yards, packed with millions of board feet of dry timber, ignited almost instantly. Within moments, the riverfront exploded into its own chain of fires, creating a second inferno that pushed north and east toward the heart of the city. The river itself became a grim spectacle. Grease, oil, and waste from factories had long accumulated on its surface, forming a thin but highly flammable sheen. When embers fell on this oily film, portions of the water appeared to catch fire, creating the illusion that the river had been transformed into a ribbon of burning liquid. Witnesses reported that flames danced across the water and wrapped around moored boats, which then also caught fire. This horrifying visual only added to the sense that the city was trapped in a nightmare that defied all known logic. Fire crews stationed along the river suddenly found themselves flanked on both sides, making escape routes increasingly limited. They were forced to abandon hoses and equipment in a desperate attempt to keep ahead of the growing walls of heat. As the fire expanded, the South Division, the bustling commercial heart of Chicago, became its next victim. Businesses, warehouses, printing houses, and factories were packed tightly together, many filled with combustible materials like paper, cloth, chemicals, and crates. Flames swept from building to building, feeding on this abundance of fuel. The heat grew so intense that windows exploded outward, sending shards of glass flying into the streets. Wooden sidewalks, a ubiquitous feature throughout Chicago, acted like fuses, helping the fire travel along roadways at terrifying speed. People who believed they were safe several blocks away suddenly found the fire upon them with almost no warning. The city's fire department, now fragmented and overwhelmed, could do little to stem the tide. Water pressure dipped even lower as hydrants failed or pipes ruptured from the extreme heat. Firefighters worked until the leather of their boots began to smolder, until their hands blistered from hot metal, until the smoke made breathing nearly impossible. Citizens attempted bucket brigades, but their efforts were tragically symbolic. They were no match for the scale of destruction advancing through their streets. The fire was no longer a disaster to be fought. It had become an elemental force reshaping the city's geography, consuming everything in its path. By the time midnight approached, the fire had grown into a monster that held the entire South Division hostage. The crossing of the river, once thought impossible, marked a psychological turning point. Chicagoans realized that no part of the city was truly safe. The fire had demonstrated an unpredictable, almost supernatural capacity to overcome obstacles. And with thousands fleeing northward, the stage was set for the next heartbreaking chapter, when the fire would turn toward Chicago's most densely populated districts and push the city to the brink of total collapse. As the night deepened, chaos spread faster than even the flames could. Thousands of residents poured into the streets, carrying whatever belongings they could grasp. Children, pets, trunks, bedding, family papers, religious items, and random possessions grabbed in desperation. The noise was overwhelming. The roar of the fire, the crash of collapsing buildings, the screams of separated families, the cries of horses, and the frantic shouts of firefighters directing people away from dangerous paths. Amid this swirling panic, the structure of the city's emergency response collapsed entirely. Communications between fire companies were severed as telegraph lines burned or fell. Command posts were abandoned when encroaching flames left them untenable. Firefighters did not know where to regroup, and ordinary citizens no longer knew which streets were safe to travel. Chicago's narrow streets, normally busy but navigable, became clogged with humanity. Carts overloaded with furniture overturned, blocking paths. Herds of livestock from nearby stockyards stampeded through residential blocks, adding to the confusion. People fleeing north collided with crowds trying to escape from the west, forming bottlenecks where movement slowed to an agonizing crawl. Some individuals attempted to outrun the fire while pushing wheelbarrows or dragging trunks, but the speed of the flames often overtook them, forcing many to abandon their belongings mid-flight. The psychological toll was devastating. People who had spent years building a modest but stable life were forced to watch everything they owned disappear into flames behind them. Social boundaries dissolved under the pressure of survival. Wealthy families fleeing from the South Division found themselves shoulder to shoulder with impoverished laborers, each confronting the same terror. Churches opened their doors to refugees until heat forced them to evacuate. Saloons became temporary shelters. Courtyards, riverbanks, and even cemeteries filled with frightened citizens seeking any refuge from the relentless advance of fire. Yet even these temporary sanctuaries were often short-lived. Glowing embers carried by the wind frequently ignited new fires miles ahead of the main blaze, forcing further retreat. Among the most heartbreaking scenes were those involving children and the elderly. Parents, weighed down by bundles, sometimes lost their grip on their children's hands amid the crush of bodies. Elderly residents who could not move quickly enough were carried on makeshift stretchers or pushed in carts. Some families made it to open spaces, such as public squares or lakefront parks, believing the wide expanse would protect them. Others aimed for the North Division, unaware that it too would soon be under siege. The mayor attempted to issue directives, but with communication broken and much of the city government displaced, official leadership had virtually evaporated. By 12:30 a.m., Chicago was a city in full retreat. Its people pushed steadily northward as the fire consumed everything behind them. Panic had overtaken planning. Survival had replaced order. And as the flames continued to gain strength, the fire was preparing to cross yet another threshold, advancing into the North Division and leaving an even larger trail of devastation. The collapse of coordination, the breakdown of systems, and the overwhelming human fear of that night revealed the fragility of even the most ambitious urban dreams. Chicago, proud and rapidly growing, was learning in the harshest way that a city built quickly and carelessly could just as quickly be undone. The downtown business district of Chicago, its proud commercial core, was considered the engine of the city's astonishing rise, a district bursting with banks, wholesale houses, printing firms, hotels, offices, and grand public buildings. Many Chicagoans believed this part of the city was nearly invincible, protected by wider streets, sturdier construction, and a sense of importance that seemed to render it immune to the hazards threatening poorer neighborhoods. Yet, as the fire surged relentlessly north and east shortly after midnight, this illusion evaporated with devastating speed. The business district, though boasting some brick and stone exteriors, was not the fortress people imagined. Behind the facades lay wooden interiors, wooden floors, combustible stockpiles, and networks of enclosed spaces that allowed flames and heat to circulate like air in a furnace. When the fire reached the South Division's commercial center, it found a feast waiting for it. The Powerhouse, one of the city's most luxurious hotels and a symbol of Chicago's success, was among the buildings to face the earliest assault in downtown. Though celebrated for its elegance and size, it was still vulnerable to drifting embers and intense radiant heat. Guests inside hurriedly evacuated, carrying what they could before the structure succumbed to flames. Across the district, similarly grand establishments, the Oriental, the Metropolitan, the Sherman House, faced the same fate. The fire seized upon storefronts with remarkable efficiency. Dry goods stores filled with fabric, furnishings, and packaging material became explosions of color and heat as flames burst through display windows. The wood-block streets, soaked in tar and softened by heat, ignited as though they had been laid expressly to carry fire deeper into the heart of the city. One of the most catastrophic losses was the Chicago Tribune building, home to the city's most influential newspaper and a powerful voice in regional politics and civic life. Its presses, which had printed millions of pages celebrating Chicago's growth, became the fuel for its destruction. Bales of newsprint, wooden shelving, and combustible ink compounds fed the flames with terrifying speed. Staff attempted to rescue documents and equipment, but the heat drove them back, forcing them to retreat as the building collapsed in a shower of sparks. It was a symbolic moment. Chicago's voice of record had been silenced overnight, leaving the city not only physically damaged, but also struck speechless. Banks and financial houses fared no better. Vaults, presumed to be fireproof, were subjected to heat so extreme that many warped, fused shut, or proved inadequate to protect their contents. Merchants and investors watched helplessly as the institutions that held their fortunes crumbled. Insurance offices, ironically, were among the most heavily damaged structures. The loss of property records, financial ledgers, and claims documents added layers of administrative chaos to an already uncontrollable crisis. Further complicating the disaster was the destruction of law offices, city records, and legal institutions, which resulted in the loss of decades of documentation vital for property rights, business claims, and civic administration. As a firestorm closed in, the heat in the downtown area grew nearly unbearable. Eyewitnesses described flames leaping hundreds of feet into the night sky, twisting and bending in the wind like enormous fiery serpents. The air became thick with ash and debris, burning eyes and scorching lungs. Firefighters, driven back again and again, battled until their equipment melted or their horses collapsed. Eventually, even the bravest crews realized that the fight for downtown Chicago was lost. They retreated north, exhausted, defeated, and haunted by the sight of the city's economic heart being devoured behind them. By the time the flames finished sweeping through the business district, Chicago's commercial core no longer existed in recognizable form. The proud skyline, though modest by modern standards, was reduced to smoldering rubble, jagged walls, and piles of debris still glowing in the night. The destruction of this district was more than a physical loss. It signaled the collapse of the city's sense of stability, prosperity, and invulnerability. Chicago was no longer a place defined by its rapid growth and ambition. It had become a city fighting for survival, pushed into a future shaped not by triumph, but by the humbling reality of nature's overwhelming power. No part of Chicago was more densely populated or more socially diverse than the North Division, the area that lay beyond the downtown district and stretched toward the upper reaches of the city. It was here that families of all backgrounds, immigrants, craftsmen, merchants, laborers, children, the elderly, lived in tightly packed blocks of wooden homes, each one a potential spark in the vast inferno. As thousands of residents fled northward for safety, many believed the river and the vastness of downtown's brick structures would stop the flames. But when the fire crossed the Chicago River's main branch just after 1 a.m., driven by winds so fierce that eyewitnesses swore the flames traveled horizontally, hope evaporated instantly. The North Division was not just vulnerable, it was doomed. The area's layout amplified the disaster. Narrow streets, wooden sidewalks, lattice fences, and closely spaced homes created a landscape that allowed fire to move with terrifying speed. Embers blew across blocks faster than people could run, igniting rooftops and porches long before the flames at street level arrived. Residents who had paused to gather belongings found themselves trapped by fire that appeared from above and behind rather than ahead. Many were forced to abandon everything, fleeing into alleys, open fields, or directly toward the lakefront. The fire's advance was so rapid that people reported seeing flames chasing their heels, gaining on them like a predator. Churches, once seen as sanctuaries, quickly became symbols of helplessness. St. James Cathedral, one of the most prominent churches in the North Division, had walls made of heavy stone, but its interior was filled with wood. When the roof ignited, flames shot through the belfry like a torch, and the spire collapsed in a fiery shower. Other churches met the same fate, their bells melting or crashing to the ground in scenes that survivors described as apocalyptic. Schools, theaters, and public halls were reduced to ashes within minutes of ignition, leaving entire communities without places of worship, learning, or assembly. One of the most tragic aspects of the fire in the North Division was the immense human displacement it caused. Tens of thousands of people fled through streets already choked with smoke and debris. Parents struggled to keep their families together, calling out names in the darkness as flames roared and structures fell behind them. Crowds pushed toward the Lincoln Park area and the lakeshore, filling these open spaces with desperate huddles of humanity. Domestic animals, dogs, horses, goats, ran loose or followed their fleeing owners, adding to the confusion. In the crush of people attempting to escape, carts overturned, children fell, and the elderly collapsed in exhaustion. The wealthy neighborhoods near the lakefront were not spared. Elegant homes and mansions, built with more substantial materials than their working-class counterparts, still contained enough wooden elements to burn ferociously once the fire reached them. Priceless furniture, art, and family heirlooms were hurriedly thrown into wagons, only to be abandoned when flames cut off escape routes. Even those who escaped with belongings often lost them as the wind carried burning debris onto the piles of possessions scattered across the ground. As the fire marched northward, it erased everything in its path. Homes, businesses, landmarks, entire neighborhoods that had taken decades to build. By dawn, the North Division was a charred wasteland stretching from river to lake. A landscape so thoroughly transformed that residents who returned the following days had difficulty identifying the lots where their homes once stood. The loss was not only physical, but cultural and communal. The North Division had been the living heart of Chicago's diverse society, and now it lay in ruins extinguished under the weight of a disaster that no one had believed possible. As the fire consumed the North Division and the remaining escape routes shrank rapidly, tens of thousands of Chicagoans found themselves pushed inexorably toward the lakefront. Lake Michigan, calm and cold that night, became the final refuge for a population with nowhere else to run. Families who had already lost their homes now faced the terror of deciding whether to remain on land as fiery debris fell around them or venture into the frigid water to escape the heat. Many chose both, standing knee-deep in the lake while clutching what few belongings they had salvaged, praying that the wind would eventually shift or that the flames would finally exhaust themselves. The lakeshore soon became a vast, chaotic refugee camp. People huddled together for warmth against the cool lake wind, shivering not only from cold but from fear and trauma. Those who had managed to bring blankets, coats, or bundles of clothing shared with neighbors who had escaped empty-handed. Cries of children echoed along the shoreline, and parents attempted to soothe them despite the unimaginable circumstances. Horses and other animals, driven mad with fear, ran along the beach or swam out into the water, some drowning in the confusion. When buildings near the lakeshore exploded or collapsed, the noise carried over the water with a thunderous force that made many refugees believe the city itself was tearing apart. As the fire drew closer, the heat became unbearable even on the beach. Airborne embers landed on clothing and hair, forcing people to pat themselves down again and again. Some held wet cloths over their faces to breathe, dipping them repeatedly into the cold lake. Others submerged themselves completely, wading underwater as long as they could before coming up for breath between waves of heat. Those who stayed on the sand moved constantly, shifting away from advancing flames or scattering when burning boards were carried overhead by the wind. Every moment was a calculation of survival. Stay too close to the fire and you risk suffocation or burns. Move too far into the water and hypothermia threatened. Amid the chaos, acts of kindness shone through. Strangers helped elderly residents walk to the water's edge. Families without children looked after those who became separated from their parents. Women comforted infants who had lost their voices from crying. Doctors and nurses who had fled with the crowd tended to burns and injuries using improvised supplies. Torn fabric, lake water, pieces of driftwood as splints. People shared food, matches, and even pieces of furniture that had been dragged from burning homes before the fire overtook them. For many, the most haunting moment came when the wooden boardwalks and structures north of downtown ignited, sending flames racing down the beach itself. Refugees were forced to wade deeper into the lake, some up to their waists or chests, until the fire passed. Children screamed in the freezing water, and parents clung to them tightly, fearing both the fire behind and the cold before them. Eventually, after hours of terror, the winds weakened and the fire's intensity began to diminish. By dawn on October 10th, the survivors stood along a lakeshore littered with soaked possessions, ash, burned debris, and stunned silence. Behind them, the city smoldered. Before them, Lake Michigan stretched wide and indifferent. The flight to the lake became one of the defining images of the Great Chicago Fire, not simply because of its desperation, but because it illustrated how a modern American city had been reduced to the most elemental struggle for survival. Fire behind, water ahead, and humanity caught between forces far beyond its control. The experience would shape the memories and trauma of an entire generation of Chicagoans who would forever remember the night they fled into the lake to stay alive. When dawn broke on the morning of October 10th, 1871, the people of Chicago emerged from their places of refuge, along the lakeshore, in open fields, in makeshift shelters, and faced a sight so alien and devastating that many later described it as stepping into another world. What had once been one of the fastest growing cities in America, vibrant with industry, commerce, and ambition, now resembled a battlefield after an apocalyptic defeat. Block after block lay in smoking ruins, a blackened wasteland stretching as far as the eye could see. The outlines of once familiar neighborhoods had vanished. Streets were buried beneath charred timber, collapsed walls, smoldering bricks, and twisted metal. Even the sky seemed altered, hazy with lingering smoke that muted the rising sun into a dull orange glow. People walked slowly, silently, as though moving through a shared nightmare. The first sensation that struck returning residents was not sight, however, but smell, a powerful mixture of wet ash, burned wood, scorched earth, and the acrid remnants of thousands of destroyed buildings. The scent clung to clothing, hair, and skin. It filled mouths and lungs with every breath. Many survivors had spent the night cramped on the cold sand of the lakeshore or in parks, shivering without blankets, their clothes soaked from wading into the water. Some had not slept at all, too traumatized by the fire's advance, too frightened to close their eyes in case the flames returned. When they finally rose at dawn, they did so with stiff limbs, raw throats, and a gnawing uncertainty about what remained of their homes. As they ventured back into the city, they found themselves wandering through terrain unrecognizable even to lifelong residents. Streets that once bustled with people and horse-drawn wagons were now indistinguishable from the heaps of rubble surrounding them. In many areas, not a single structure remained standing. In others, only skeletal walls jutted upward, fragile and close to collapse. The burnt remains of churches, schools, factories, and shops lay in tangled piles, mingled with melted glass, shattered brick, and the warped metal frames of machinery. Telegraph poles had toppled like rows of matchsticks, and railway tracks had twisted from the intense heat. The metal wheels of destroyed fire engines lay half-buried in ash. Certain landmarks once considered indestructible were now ruins. The elegant churches of the North Division had vanished, their stone shells cracked open, their towers fallen like dead giants. The courthouse, the symbol of civic authority, lay gutted, its bell melted into a heavy, unrecognizable lump. Downtown's proud commercial blocks, symbols of Chicago's confidence, were leveled. The Tribune building lay silent, its presses buried beneath debris. The grand hotels that had hosted travelers, businessmen, and dignitaries were nothing more than piles of brick and iron barely recognizable as former centers of luxury. Amid this destruction, human figures moved uncertainly. Families searching for the lots where their houses had stood, merchants seeking the remnants of their storefronts, employers hoping their employees had survived. People stopped at certain corners and turned slowly, trying to match memory with devastation. Many could identify their home's location only by the shape of a surviving tree trunk or the position of a half-buried fence post. Others could not find any trace at all, the fire having erased every familiar boundary. Despite the overwhelming scale of destruction, there was also an unmistakable spirit visible in the survivors. Exhausted but alive, they began clearing paths, gathering scattered belongings, and comforting those who wept upon discovering total loss. The morning after the fire was not just the moment of Chicago's greatest despair. It was the moment when thousands realized they would have to build a future from nothing but ash and memory. And though they could not yet imagine how, the first quiet steps toward recovery began that very morning, even as smoke continued to rise from the ruins of their city. In the aftermath of the Great Chicago Fire, the human toll revealed itself in layers, slowly, painfully, and with a weight that pressed upon every survivor. Although the official death toll is typically estimated at around 300, most historians agree the real number was almost certainly much higher, possibly reaching into the thousands. Many victims were never recovered, their remains consumed by the intensity of the flames or buried beneath collapsed structures. Entire families have been separated during the chaos. Children lost in the crush of evacuees. Elderly residents unable to outrun the advancing fire. Workers trapped in burning warehouses, and residents who misjudged escape routes. In the early morning hours, survivors searched desperately for loved ones, calling names into the ruined streets, hoping for a response that never came. Hospitals, those that had not burned, overflowed with patients suffering from smoke inhalation, burns, broken limbs, and exhaustion. Makeshift medical stations were set up in parks, along the lakefront, and in any surviving public building. Nurses and doctors worked tirelessly, improvising treatments with limited supplies. Water was scarce, food scarcer, and shelter nearly non-existent for the estimated 90,000 people left homeless. Families huddled together for warmth, still wearing the soot-covered clothes they had escaped in. Some individuals wandered in shock, barely speaking, while others gathered in small groups to recount the events of the night, trying to make sense of the incomprehensible. As the sun rose higher, city officials attempted to restore order, though their efforts were hampered by the destruction of communication systems, government offices, and transportation routes. Mayor Roswell B. Mason, exhausted yet determined, issued a series of proclamations aimed at preventing looting, maintaining public safety, and coordinating relief efforts. Martial law was not formally declared, but troops from nearby military posts were deployed to patrol the streets, protect supply stations, and assist in clearing debris. Their presence provided a measure of security in a city where desperation could easily have given way to chaos. One of the most immediate concerns was providing shelter for the tens of thousands displaced. Families erected temporary huts made from scrap lumber scavenged from ruins. Others used tarps, canvas sheets, or even large pieces of furniture to create makeshift lean-tos. The largest encampments formed in open areas such as Lincoln Park, the prairie northwest of the city center, and along the lakefront. At night, campfires dotted the shoreline as people gathered around them for warmth and safety. These encampments quickly became small communities, with residents sharing food, exchanging information, and watching over each other's children. Supply distribution quickly became a monumental task. Chicago's surviving merchants donated what goods they could, and relief trains, upon learning of the disaster, began arriving from neighboring cities. Food, blankets, clothing, tools, and medicine were unloaded and transported to relief stations established around the city perimeter. Volunteers stepped forward to organize lines, record names, and ensure fair distribution. Churches from undamaged suburbs sent clergy and supplies. Even in the depths of tragedy, the response from surrounding communities reflected a deep sense of regional solidarity. Yet challenges remained. The city's water system was crippled, meaning clean drinking water had to be rationed or brought in by wagon. Food supplies, though replenished quickly, were insufficient for the size of the population in need. Families struggled to maintain dignity while standing in long lines for basic necessities. Confusion about missing persons ran rampant. Temporary notice boards filled with handwritten messages, names of lost relatives, descriptions of found children, pleas for information, appeared throughout the surviving districts. In the midst of all this, Chicago's resilient spirit flickered to life. People began clearing debris from streets so relief wagons could pass. They offered comfort to neighbors who had lost everything. They shared stories of bravery and survival. They grieved together, worked together, and began to imagine, however faintly, the possibility of rebuilding. Though they stood in a city shattered beyond recognition, the first attempts at restoring order and hope were already taking shape. As the immediate shock of the fire slowly gave way to the urgent realities of survival, Chicago entered a new phase of the disaster, mobilizing widespread relief and determining responsibility. The scale of destruction demanded cooperation across all levels: individual, local, national, and even international. Within hours of the tragedy becoming known outside the city, aid began arriving from towns across Illinois and states throughout the Midwest. Relief trains carried food, water, blankets, and clothing. Volunteer fire companies came with equipment to douse the remaining hotspots, while medical teams arrived to help treat the wounded. Churches, civic groups, and newly formed committees worked tirelessly to organize incoming supplies and distribute them to the tens of thousands in need. One of the fastest and most influential relief organizations was the Chicago Relief and Aid Society, which immediately established headquarters in an undamaged corner of the city. The society took charge of coordinating donations, distributing essential items, and identifying families most urgently in need. Their work was monumental, providing food to the hungry, clothing to those who had escaped with nothing but night clothes, temporary housing for the displaced, and medical assistance for the injured. This effort transformed the society into a powerful civic force during the weeks following the fire. Their records documented the immense human cost and needs of the population. Those who had lost homes, those without employment, those searching for missing relatives. Other forms of support poured in from across the nation and beyond. Newspapers in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and cities throughout Europe published urgent appeals for donations. Money flowed in from individuals, charities, and even foreign governments. London, Paris, Berlin, and Rome sent funds to support Chicago's recovery. The scale of international assistance underscored how deeply the tragedy had resonated. Chicago, though still a young city, had become symbolically significant on the global stage, representing American industrial growth and Western expansion. Its destruction struck a nerve far beyond its borders. Yet while relief efforts gathered momentum, questions about accountability began to circulate. People wanted answers. How could this have happened? Who was to blame? Could it have been prevented? The O'Leary family, unfortunately, became an easy target for scapegoating. Newspapers, desperate for sensational stories, exaggerated rumors, and fabricated details, depicting Mrs. O'Leary as a careless immigrant whose supposed irresponsibility ignited the catastrophe. Despite the lack of evidence, and despite testimony that she had been asleep when the fire began, the myth persisted. It was easier for many to blame a single household than to confront the far more uncomfortable truth that the fire was the result of systemic failures in urban planning, infrastructure, and public policy. Official investigations soon made it clear that no single person or event had caused the destruction. Instead, multiple factors contributed: prolonged drought, fierce winds, construction practices that prioritize speed over safety, inadequate water systems, exhausted firefighters, miscommunication and alarm routing, and the inherent vulnerability created by a predominantly wooden city. The fire was not one person's fault. It was a civic failure decades in the making. Yet the search for accountability served an important purpose. It forced Chicago's leaders to confront the deficiencies that had made the disaster so catastrophic. In the days following the fire, public meetings were held to discuss rebuilding plans, fire safety reforms, and a need for new building codes. Engineers and architects surveyed the ruins, drafting proposals for wider streets, stronger materials, and better water distribution systems. Though the city was still in shock, the seeds of transformation were already being planted, seeds that would eventually grow into the new, modern Chicago. But for the survivors walking through the ruins on those early October days, the future remained uncertain. Their immediate focus was survival, grief, and the slow process of piecing their lives back together, even as the charred remains of their city still smoldered around them. In the weeks immediately following the Great Chicago Fire, the city found itself standing at a crossroads between despair and determination. The destruction was immense. Over 3 square miles reduced to ash, more than 17,000 buildings destroyed, and nearly a third of the population left homeless. Yet amid this unprecedented devastation, a resolve began to take root among Chicago's citizens and leaders. It was a resolve shaped by necessity, pride, and an unwavering belief that the city could not merely return to what it had been, but must rise again stronger, safer, and grander than before. The urgency of the situation demanded action from every corner of the community, from the wealthiest industrialists to the most modest laborers. During the first weeks, makeshift tents, wooden shanties, and temporary relief stations dominated the landscape. These improvised shelters served as both homes and workplaces for thousands who had nowhere else to go. Relief organizations distributed food, clothing, and tools, while local churches offered spiritual comfort and emotional support. Fires still smoldered in some areas, casting threads of smoke into the sky as survivors began the painful task of sorting through debris. People searched for salvageable items: metal pots warped by heat, scorched picture frames, partially burned books, or fragments of furniture. Although these remnants could never replace what had been lost, they offered emotional anchoring for people whose lives had been violently upended. City leaders understood that they needed to act quickly, not only to restore order, but to prevent mass exodus. Chicago's population had been built on confidence, opportunity, and migration. If people lost faith in the city's future, the economy could collapse. In late October, just weeks after the fire, a series of public meetings erupted with energy. Businessmen, architects, civic officials, and citizens crowded into halls to discuss strategies for rebuilding. The debates were lively, sometimes heated, but almost always forward-looking. Topics ranged from new building materials to street widening, infrastructure improvements, fire safety regulations, and the redesign of entire districts. Many argued for brick and stone to replace wood. Others insisted that modern engineering techniques must be adopted, including the new concept of fireproof construction. Engineers examined the city's infrastructure, noting weaknesses in the water system that had left hydrants dry at critical moments. The pumping stations needed overhaul, water mains needed expanding, and fire reservoirs needed relocation. Chicago had grown so quickly in the decades before the fire that infrastructure had lagged dangerously behind. Now, with so much of the city cleared, leaders saw a rare opportunity to correct past mistakes. Newspaper editorials echoed this sentiment, urging citizens to embrace modernity and innovation. The press, even with limited resources and makeshift printing presses, encouraged Chicagoans not to be paralyzed by loss, but to seize the moment for transformation. Simultaneously, investors, real estate developers, and business owners pushed for rapid reconstruction, fearing that delays would hamper economic recovery. The city's business district, though devastated, was vital to national commerce. Railroads, banks, and warehouses sought temporary facilities, determined to resume operations as quickly as possible. This urgency created tension between those advocating for careful, thoughtful planning and those insisting that speed was essential for survival. The city teetered between these competing visions, trying to balance long-term improvement with immediate necessity. Despite their challenges, Chicagoans displayed remarkable resilience. Merchants sold goods from tents. Lawyers worked from borrowed desks. Schools held classes in churches or outdoor pavilions. Print shops re-established operations with scavenged equipment. The sound of hammers, saws, and shovels echoed throughout the ruins, an early symphony of reconstruction. While the wounds of the fire were still raw, the first weeks marked the beginning of a profound transformation. Chicago was becoming not simply a rebuilt city, but a reinvented one, shaped by the lessons of catastrophe and inspired by the dreams of a population determined to rise from ashes to opportunity. As Chicago moved from the immediate aftermath of the fire into the early stages of long-term rebuilding, debates over the city's future reached new levels of intensity and intellectual ambition. For the first time in its history, Chicago found itself compelled to ask fundamental questions. What should a modern city look like? How should it function? How might it protect its citizens from future disasters? These questions were not merely philosophical. They were logistical, economic, and deeply personal for a population that had recently watched their homes burn to the ground. In this environment of urgency and creativity, architects, engineers, city officials, and civic reformers engaged in conversations that would ultimately shape the character of Chicago for generations. One of the most controversial issues involved building materials. Chicago had always been a wooden city. Lumber from Wisconsin and Michigan had made construction cheap, fast, and accessible, fueling decades of explosive growth. But the fire had exposed the dangers of such reliance. Now, as architects proposed bold new designs using brick, stone, and iron, lumber merchants pushed back, fearing economic ruin. Debates raged in newspapers, city councils, and business meetings. Should it be banned? Should brick be required for all new buildings? Or should regulations merely encourage, rather than mandate, safer materials? Some argued that strict codes would slow reconstruction and drive away builders. Others insisted that without such regulations, Chicago would remain a tinderbox vulnerable to future catastrophe. Meanwhile, engineers studied the ruins and identified critical flaws in the city's infrastructure, especially its water system. The pumping station on Pine Street had barely survived the fire and needed reinforcement. The city needed more hydrants, larger water mains, and increased reservoir capacity. Proposals circulated for completely redesigning the system, incorporating redundancies to ensure that a single failure would not cripple the entire firefighting effort again. These technical discussions often seemed abstract to ordinary citizens, yet they were essential to preventing future disasters. Fire safety had moved beyond the realm of firefighters. It had become an engineering discipline. Urban planners and architects also saw the fire as an opportunity to improve street layouts. Many envisioned wider boulevards, more public squares, expanded parks, and better separation between industrial and residential districts. The fire had exposed how easily densely packed neighborhoods could ignite like dominoes. Some reformers argued that creating green corridors and fire breaks would save lives in the future. Visionaries proposed grand avenues modeled after Paris, with promenades, monuments, and tree-lined streets. Others wanted a more practical approach: improved traffic flow, better drainage, and roadways designed for increasing numbers of horse-drawn and steam-powered vehicles. At the center of these debates stood a handful of forward-thinking architects whose ideas would eventually reshape the skylines of the world. Though the famed Chicago School of Architecture would emerge more fully in the decades after the fire, its philosophical roots were planted during these critical discussions. The notion that steel, glass, and innovative vertical construction methods could revolutionize urban life took hold early, nurtured by the simple fact that the fire had wiped the slate clean. In a city where everything needed rebuilding, imagination suddenly had fertile ground. Yet not every debate was driven by idealism. Property owners worried about costs, insisting that overly strict regulations would make rebuilding unaffordable. Many working-class families simply wanted to reconstruct modest homes and resume their lives, uninterested in grand urban theories. Politicians, caught between pressure groups, struggled to balance safety with affordability. Some proposed two sets of building standards: stricter rules for the downtown core and more flexible guidelines for residential districts. Others warned that such compromises would invite future tragedy. Despite disagreements, one truth united the city. The fire had taught Chicago a lesson it would never forget. Planning, building, and living in a city required more than ambition. It required foresight, safety, and intelligent design. The debates that unfolded during the rebuilding period would ultimately guide Chicago toward a new identity, transforming it into a birthplace of modern architecture and a global symbol of innovation. While ordinary citizens rebuilt homes and city leaders discussed planning reforms, another powerful force began working beneath the surface of Chicago's recovery: the resurrection of its economic engines. Before the fire, Chicago had been one of the busiest commercial hubs in the United States, driven by railroads, manufacturing, wholesale trade, and the nationally important grain and livestock industries. For Chicago to survive long term, it needed its economic arteries to start pumping once again, and quickly. What followed was one of the most astonishing economic rebounds in American history. A revival so fast and determined that observers across the world marveled at Chicago's resilience. Railroads were the first industry to return. Although depots, warehouses, and offices had been destroyed, the rail lines themselves remained largely intact. Within days, the major railroad companies, the Illinois Central, the Chicago and Northwestern, the Michigan Central, and others, set up temporary stations and resumed operations. Supplies, relief goods, building materials, and manpower began pouring into the city with surprising efficiency. The speed at which rail traffic resumed reassured investors and citizens alike. Chicago remained the nation's rail hub, and that position was not about to be ceded. The lumber industry, ironically both victim and contributor to the city's vulnerability, also surged during rebuilding. Lumber yards along the river had burned spectacularly during the fire, yet fresh lumber shipments began arriving within hours of the disaster. Rafts of timber floated down the lake from Michigan and Wisconsin, delivering the raw materials needed for immediate shelter construction. Though debates about fire-safe materials persisted, what remained essential for temporary housing, scaffolding, and interior framing. Lumber merchants, though criticized for past practices, became indispensable in the early months of reconstruction. Manufacturing plants, many of which have been destroyed, began relocating temporarily to the city's periphery or to surviving suburbs. Blacksmiths, carpenters, brickmakers, wagon builders, and metalworkers worked around the clock producing tools, nails, bricks, and machinery needed to rebuild. The sound of industry, hammering, sawing, forging, echoed across the ruins, signaling that Chicago's mechanical heart had begun beating again. Contractors hired thousands of laborers, including immigrants newly arriving in the city, transforming Chicago into one of the largest construction zones in the nation. Wholesale and retail merchants displayed equal determination. Many erected temporary tents or wooden sheds labeled with hastily painted signs announcing their businesses were still open. The business district, though physically erased, experienced a spiritual revival. By the end of the first month, dozens of shops, saloons, restaurants, and offices were operating out of temporary quarters. Customers, eager to return to routines, flocked to these makeshift establishments, boosting morale and commerce simultaneously. Perhaps the most critical economic engine to revive was the grain and livestock trade. Chicago's connection to Midwestern agriculture was unparalleled, and the ability to move grain, cattle, and pork through the city was vital to the national economy. The stockyards, though damaged, reopened quickly. Grain elevators along the river were repaired or rebuilt, and shipping resumed at remarkable speed. This restoration reassured cities across the country that Chicago remained the central market for agricultural goods. As these industries regained strength, the city's economic confidence surged. Investments flowed back in, and credit became available for rebuilding projects. Insurance companies, though battered by unprecedented claims, assessed losses and resumed issuing policies, albeit at higher rates. The rapid return of industry did more than rebuild Chicago's economy. It rebuilt its identity. It signaled to the world that Chicago was not defeated. Flames had reduced its physical form to ashes, but its economic spirit burned brighter than ever. In the resilience of its businesses, industries, and workers, Chicago found the foundation upon which its future greatness would be built. In the months following the Great Chicago Fire, one of the most extraordinary aspects of the city's recovery was the way ordinary people, families, neighbors, and entire communities banded together to rebuild not only their homes, but the social fabric that defined their lives. While newspapers and official histories often highlight the dramatic rebuilding of the business district and the emergence of new architectural movements, it is equally important to understand the quieter, more intimate process through which Chicagoans recreated their sense of belonging and stability. For many, the fire had not just destroyed physical structures, it had uprooted their identities. Neighborhoods that had taken years to cultivate, where relationships grew over back fences, and local saloons, churches, and corner stores were suddenly wiped clean. The return to normal life depended on more than bricks and lumber. It required the patient reconstruction of community bonds. Families who lost everything often returned to their lots within days, even if those lots contained nothing more than charred beams or a patch of scorched earth. Parents led their children across the ruins, pointing out where kitchens once stood, where bedrooms were located, and where gardens had grown. These emotional journeys were more than nostalgic. They were acts of reclaiming memory. Neighbors who recognized one another through soot-covered faces or familiar voices reunited with embraces, tears, and shared recollections of the terrifying flight from the flames. These early reunions formed the basis of the community's emotional healing. Even those who planned to rebuild elsewhere returned to the ruins to look for keepsakes, share stories, or offer help. As temporary shelters filled the city, new patterns of communal life began to emerge. Shanties built from scavenged wood-lined streets that would later house brick homes. These improvised dwellings, despite their fragility, became sites of fellowship. Women cooked communal meals over shared fires. Children formed makeshift playgrounds on empty lots, turning the vast destruction into a temporary landscape of imagination. Immigrant communities, especially the Irish, German, Scandinavian, and newly arriving Eastern Europeans, relied heavily on extended kinship networks and cultural traditions to maintain a sense of order. Birthdays were celebrated even in tents. Weddings were held in churches that had barely survived. Funerals honored those lost during the fire, helping families process grief in collective ways. Church congregations were among the strongest forces for rebuilding community. Even when their sanctuaries had burned to the ground, Congregations gathered in open fields or borrowed spaces. Pastors, priests, and rabbis offered comfort, conducted services, and helped coordinate relief efforts. These spiritual leaders became pillars of strength, offering words of hope and reminding residents that resilience was part of their shared identity. Churches played vital roles in distributing goods, finding housing for displaced families, and organizing volunteer groups to clean streets or rebuild homes. They provided a sense of continuity in a world that seemed to have been turned upside down. Local businesses also helped restore familiar rhythms of life. Grocers set up small stalls with salvaged goods. Tailors stitched new garments from donated fabric. Barbers cut hair outdoors beneath tarps. Every reopened shop, no matter how small, signaled to residents that their community was alive. Social activities slowly returned. Music in saloons, neighbors exchanging news in front of shanties, and children walking to temporary schoolhouses. These simple interactions, trivial in ordinary times, became potent symbols of recovery. By the end of the first winter after the fire, many temporary neighborhoods had evolved into tightly knit communities defined by shared hardship. The memory of escaping the flames, losing homes, and rebuilding side by side created bonds stronger than those formed under normal circumstances. Chicagoans found strength not in isolation, but in cooperation. Their determination proved that community is not a physical place. It is a living network of relationships, commitments, and shared experiences. Even as the city transformed physically, these human connections formed the true foundation of Chicago's rebirth. One of the most profound indicators of Chicago's resilience after the fire was the rapid and determined revival of its educational system. Schools played an essential role in restoring normalcy to the lives of children who had endured terror, displacement, and the loss of their familiar surroundings. For parents, the reopening of schools offered a sense of stability and hope for the future, proof that despite the city's traumas, life would continue and the next generation would still have the opportunity to dream and achieve. Rebuilding schools was not simply about creating classrooms. It was about restoring civic identity and reaffirming the city's commitment to knowledge, progress, and upward mobility. Immediately after the fire, Chicago's public schools faced tremendous challenges. Many buildings had burned completely, leaving only piles of brick, metal frames, and blackened foundations. Records were lost, supplies destroyed, and teachers displaced from their homes. Yet, even amid these difficulties, educators acted with extraordinary determination. Within weeks, temporary schoolhouses were erected in churches, tents, community halls, and even in the basements of buildings still under repair. School boards scrambled to secure desks, chalk, slates, textbooks, and firewood for heating. Teachers who had lost their own possessions returned to work with borrowed clothing and donated notebooks, determined to ensure that the city's children did not fall behind academically. For students, returning to school meant more than learning algebra or grammar. It meant stepping into a space where routines could reestablish a sense of emotional safety. In classrooms, teachers carefully balanced academic instruction with emotional support, recognizing the trauma their pupils had endured. Some children shared stories of fleeing through burning streets, losing family members, or living in overcrowded shelters. Others struggled with nightmares or fear of fire. Teachers organized discussions, creative writing exercises, and art activities that allowed students to express their feelings. These early forms of trauma-informed education helped children process their experiences while also strengthening classroom communities. The fire also spurred conversations about the future of public education in Chicago. With so many buildings needing replacement, Some civic leaders pushed for improvements rather than simple reconstruction. They argued for sturdier, fireproof school buildings made of brick and stone. Architects submitted designs with better ventilation, more windows, and improved safety features. Reformers insisted that the rebuilt school system should be more inclusive, offering expanded access for immigrant families and children from working-class backgrounds. Some called for vocational education to prepare students for industrial careers. Others advocated for stronger academic standards that would allow Chicago's youth to compete with students from older, more established cities in the East. These debates reflected a broader tension in post-fire Chicago, the desire to rebuild quickly versus the desire to rebuild better. While some argued that the city could not afford to waste time on lofty educational reforms, others believed that investing in schools was essential for Chicago's long-term future. Ultimately, the city pursued a balanced approach, constructing temporary wooden schools in the short term while planning more durable and modern facilities for subsequent years. Beyond physical reconstruction, the fire sparked a surge in civic pride around education. Parents, teachers, and students saw the reopening of schools as symbolic of Chicago's determination to rise again. Public ceremonies celebrated the dedication of new school buildings. Newspapers praised teachers for their commitment. Community organizers coordinated fundraisers to provide books for impoverished families and scholarships for orphan children. Education became a unifying force, reminding residents that the fire had not destroyed their collective belief in progress. By the third year after the fire, Chicago's school system was not merely restored. It had expanded, modernized, and reinvented itself. New buildings, new curricula, and new educational philosophies began shaping the minds of thousands of children. These young students, many of whom had survived the fire, grew up with a sense of resilience instilled deeply within them. Their education helped fuel the intellectual energy that would later contribute to Chicago's emergence as a center of architecture, industry, culture, and innovation. In this way, the rebirth of education played a crucial role in shaping the city's renewed identity. In the months and years following the Great Chicago Fire, the city's cultural and spiritual life underwent a powerful renaissance. While the fire had leveled entire neighborhoods and destroyed churches, theaters, libraries, and social halls, it could not extinguish the intangible forces that shaped Chicago's identity. Its faith communities, artistic spirit, and cultural diversity. In fact, the fire served as a catalyst for renewal in ways that deepened the city's sense of purpose and expanded its cultural horizons. The disaster forced residents to reflect on what truly mattered and what kind of society they wanted to rebuild. Out of that reflection emerged a new wave of spiritual solidarity, cultural innovation, and civic engagement. Faith communities led the way in providing emotional healing for a traumatized population. Churches that had burned to the ground resumed services outdoors or in temporary structures. Congregants gathered on chilly mornings in open fields or beneath makeshift tents to pray, sing hymns, and reaffirm their belief in divine guidance. Ministers delivered sermons emphasizing perseverance, unity, and moral renewal. They acknowledged the pain and suffering that residents had endured, yet encouraged them to find meaning in survival and hope in reconstruction. Religious institutions became vital centers for distributing relief supplies, organizing volunteer work, and supporting orphaned children or families who had lost everything. The Jewish community, which had been steadily growing in Chicago before the fire, also rallied together to rebuild synagogues and mutual aid societies. Jewish immigrants, many of whom arrived with few possessions, relied heavily on these networks. Relief committees helped secure housing, employment, and food. Rabbinical leaders emphasized charity and community responsibility, helping to reinforce social bonds during a time of widespread hardship. Similarly, Catholic parishes, especially those in heavily Irish neighborhoods, played an enormous role in restoring community life. Priests ministered to families affected by the fire, baptized infants born in refugee camps, and held funeral masses for victims whose remains were never recovered. Cultural institutions, though physically devastated, found ways to survive and eventually flourish. Theaters that had burned were rebuilt or reopened in temporary halls. Traveling performers visited the city, recognizing that Chicagoans desperately needed entertainment and escape from the grim realities of rebuilding. These performances ranged from comedic sketches to musical concerts, giving audiences moments of laughter, inspiration, and emotional release. The arts played an important role in restoring joy to a population still haunted by trauma. Literary culture also flourished in this period of Reconstruction. Writers, journalists, and poets documented the fire's destruction and the city's astonishing recovery. Newspapers published stories of heroism, personal loss, and communal resilience. Some authors produced reflective essays analyzing the deeper meaning of the disaster, warning against complacency, celebrating human strength, or condemning social inequalities exposed by the fire. These literary works helped shape public understanding of the tragedy, ensuring that the memory of the fire would live not just in ruins, but in the city's collective imagination. Libraries and cultural societies began rebuilding their collections, often through donations from across the country. Books poured into the city, symbolizing the intellectual rebirth that followed physical destruction. Public lectures, civic debates, and educational gatherings became common as residents sought to redefine Chicago's identity. Topics ranged from urban planning and engineering to philosophy, literature, and social reform. The fire had created not only a blank physical slate, but also an intellectual and cultural one, a space in which ideas could flourish with renewed energy. Social organizations, such as labor groups, women's associations, and cultural clubs strengthened significantly in the post-fire era. Women, in particular, played a major role in relief efforts and community rebuilding, leading to greater visibility in civic life. They organized donation drives, managed supply centers, taught children in temporary schools, and advocated for public health improvements. These contributions laid the foundation for future movements that would expand women's influence in Chicago and beyond. By the second year after the fire, Chicago's cultural and spiritual life had not merely recovered, it had deepened. Residents had forged new social connections, rediscovered the importance of faith and community, and embraced cultural creativity as a pathway to healing. This renewed social spirit became one of Chicago's defining strengths, enabling the city to rise from devastation with a richer, more vibrant identity than ever before. In the aftermath of the Great Chicago Fire, the political machinery of the city found itself thrown into unprecedented disarray. For decades, Chicago's government had operated with a mixture of ambition, corruption, and improvisation, an arrangement that barely functioned during ordinary times but became dangerously inadequate in the face of a catastrophe of this scale. The fire not only destroyed buildings and businesses, it obliterated much of the city's administrative infrastructure, leaving officials scrambling to reestablish some semblance of order. City Hall, which once housed records, offices, and legal archives, was reduced to rubble. Judicial buildings had burned, the police headquarters lay in ruins, and even the fire department's central equipment hub had been destroyed. Governance itself had to be rebuilt almost from scratch. Mayor Roswell B. Mason, a figure who had been largely unremarkable before the disaster, suddenly found himself thrust into a role of immense responsibility. In the hours after the fire, he issued emergency proclamations intended to maintain order, prevent looting, and coordinate relief distribution. He temporarily granted extraordinary powers to General Philip Sheridan, commander of the U.S. Army Forces stationed in Chicago, allowing Sheridan to deploy troops, guard streets, and enforce public safety. While some citizens welcomed the Army's presence, others feared militarization. Nevertheless, the crisis left Mason with little choice. Chicago desperately needed stability, and the Army provided a disciplined force capable of enforcing it. But as days turned into weeks, the city's governance challenges grew more complex. Without City Hall, officials were forced to set up temporary government offices in surviving buildings on the city's periphery. Clerks borrowed desks and chairs from private businesses. Judges held emergency sessions in warehouses or church basements, dealing with cases involving disputes over property, allegations of theft, and claims related to lost documents. The destruction of public records created chaos. Deeds, taxes, contracts, and legal histories have been incinerated, resolving who owned what became a monumental task. Lawyers, surveyors, and city officials worked tirelessly to recreate records through witness testimony, bank archives, insurance documents, and personal letters. Political tensions simmered beneath the surface. Critics accused the city government of being unprepared for the disaster, pointing to outdated fire codes, inadequate fire protection, and the failure to maintain the water pumping stations. Some charged that corruption had allowed unsafe building practices to flourish, while others claimed that city funds had been misallocated or poorly managed. Newspapers, despite being temporarily crippled, published biting editorials questioning whether certain officials should resign. Yet in the midst of these accusations, Chicagoans also recognized that unity was essential. Too much infighting could undermine the city's recovery at a moment when cooperation was desperately needed. One of the most contentious issues involved rebuilding regulations. The city council faced pressure from reformers demanding stricter building codes, including bans on wooden structures in the central districts. At the same time, working-class residents and small property owners protested these measures, arguing that they could not afford expensive brick or stone construction. The debate quickly escalated into a political battle reflecting deeper social divisions within Chicago. Wealthy businessmen insisted that fireproof construction was essential for the city's long-term survival, while poorer citizens feared being priced out of their own neighborhoods. City council meetings became scenes of raucous debate, with protesters shouting from the galleries and politicians trading accusations on the council floor. Amid these struggles, Mayor Mason and other city leaders worked to negotiate compromises that balanced safety with affordability. Yet progress was slow, and frustration grew among residents desperate to rebuild their homes. Newspapers reported heated exchanges, secret negotiations, and attempts by various interest groups, including lumber barons, brick manufacturers, and real estate speculators, to shape the outcome of these policies. Chicago's governance crisis, sparked by the fire, exposed the city's political vulnerabilities, but also revealed the fierce determination of its citizens to influence their own future. Despite the chaos, the city's political system did not collapse. Instead, it adapted under pressure. Officials learned to improvise, community leaders stepped into public roles, and citizens became more engaged than ever in the civic process. The fire had tested Chicago's political strength and exposed its flaws, but had also ignited a new era of activism, debate, and civic awareness. As Chicago rose from the ashes, its governance began evolving into a more responsive, modern system. one shaped by both tragedy and the collective will of its people. As Chicago entered the rebuilding stage, the political landscape became a battleground between powerful forces. Entrenched corruption, long a hallmark of the city's political culture, and a new wave of reformers galvanized by the disaster. The fire had exposed glaring weaknesses in municipal oversight, weak building codes, inadequate fire prevention, mismanaged infrastructure, and the influence of wealthy interest groups on policy decisions. Reformers saw the catastrophe as proof that Chicago needed a fundamental overhaul. Their opponents, however, viewed the crisis as an opportunity to profit, consolidate influence, and shape the rebuilt city to favor their personal or business interests. This clash of visions would define Chicago politics for years to come. Corruption was deeply woven into Chicago's political fabric prior to the fire. Aldermen frequently accepted bribes from business owners to overlook code violations or expedite permits. Contracts for public projects were often awarded to politically connected companies regardless of quality or cost. Police officers were known to turn a blind eye to gambling, saloons, or illicit activities in exchange for payments. In such an environment, enforcing safety regulations had been sporadic at best. Many investigators believed that if the city had implemented stricter fire codes or improved water systems earlier, the fire's destruction might have been far less severe. Reformers seized on this narrative, arguing that corruption had not just degraded civic life, it had cost lives. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, reform-minded citizens formed committees to investigate the disaster's causes and propose changes. They demanded transparent government, professionalized public services, and the elimination of graft. Newspaper editorials championed these causes, criticizing officials who resisted accountability. Chicago's ministers delivered sermons calling for moral renewal, urging leaders to abandon the culture of corruption that had made the city vulnerable. Civic organizations, women's groups, and immigrant societies added their voices, forming coalitions powerful enough to influence elections. On the opposite side stood a network of political figures who saw no reason to abandon their traditional methods. Some believed that strict reforms would slow rebuilding, increase costs, and harm economic growth. Others simply refused to give up lucrative streams of bribe income. Lumber merchants lobbied aggressively against restrictions on wooden construction. Property developers pressured aldermen to loosen safety regulations. Contractors with political connections secured profitable rebuilding projects. Political bosses worked behind the scenes to engineer decisions that preserved their power, promising voters jobs or favors in exchange for loyalty. The struggle intensified when the city council debated sweeping new building ordinances. Reformers pushed for mandatory fireproof materials in key districts, standardized building inspections, and improved infrastructure. Their opponents countered that such regulations would cripple small homeowners and drive away investment. The conflict became symbolic of the broader political battle. Was Chicago to be rebuilt as a model of modern urban planning? Or would it revert to the chaotic, profit-driven governance that had characterized its earlier growth? Despite fierce resistance, reformers scored some important victories. New fire limits were established for the downtown and business districts, banning wooden construction in those areas. The fire department received more funding, better equipment, and improved training standards. The water system underwent significant upgrades, including expanded mains, more hydrants, and renovated pumping stations. Civil service reforms, though slow to take root, began gaining traction as reformers demanded merit-based appointments instead of political patronage. However, corruption did not disappear. It evolved. Political machines adapted to new circumstances, finding creative ways to maintain influence in city planning, zoning, and contract allocation. The fire had disrupted old networks, but had not dismantled them entirely. Instead, the disaster intensified the ongoing tug-of-war between idealism and self-interest, one that would continue to shape Chicago's political identity well into the 20th century. Yet the fire's legacy on governance remained unmistakable. It awakened a generation of reformers who believed passionately in civic responsibility, transparency, and modernization. It demonstrated the consequences of governmental neglect and motivated ordinary citizens to demand better. In the struggle between corruption and reform, the fire became a defining catalyst, one that propelled Chicago toward a more modern, self-aware political culture, even if the path was uneven and fraught with conflict. In the years following the Great Chicago Fire, one of the greatest challenges facing the city was the restoration of public trust. The catastrophe had shaken not only buildings and infrastructure, but also the foundational belief that government and public institutions were capable of protecting citizens. Rebuilding the city physically was a monumental task, but rebuilding confidence in law, order, and civic stability required persistent effort, structural reforms, and a renewed commitment to public service. During the fire, the Chicago Police Department had been overwhelmed by the sheer scale of chaos. Stations burned, communication networks collapsed, and officers struggled to navigate streets filled with panicked residents, burning debris, and collapsing buildings. In the aftermath, the city faced increased risks of crime, not because Chicagoans turned to lawlessness en masse, but because desperation created opportunities for theft, fraud, and exploitation. Families left their temporary shelters to sift through ruins, leaving possessions vulnerable. Merchants returned to their shops to find goods scattered or missing. Rumors of looting spread rapidly, fueling public anxiety even where incidents were minimal. To combat these fears, General Philip Sheridan kept military patrols in the city for several weeks after the fire. Soldiers maintained checkpoints, supervised supply distribution, and monitored refugee camps. Their disciplined presence reassured many residents who feared unrest, though some criticized the arrangement as heavy-handed. As the city stabilized, military forces withdrew, returning authority to civilian leadership. This transition marked a crucial moment. Chicago needed to prove that it could govern itself again. The police department, recognizing its vulnerabilities, launched internal efforts to reorganize and modernize. Officers received better training, and new equipment replaced what had been lost. Patrol routes were redrawn to reflect the transformed geography of the city. The force increased its presence in crowded temporary neighborhoods where tens of thousands of residents lived in makeshift shelters. Police officers also worked closely with relief organizations to ensure orderly distribution of supplies and to help reunite families separated during the fire. Legal institutions faced equally daunting challenges. Courthouses and legal records had vanished in the flames, leaving thousands of cases unresolved. To rebuild trust in the justice system, judges and lawyers worked tirelessly to reconstruct documentation using whatever sources remained: bank statements, insurance records, family papers, and sworn testimonies. Temporary courtrooms were established in surviving buildings on the edges of the burned district. These makeshift legal hubs became symbols of the city's determination to uphold order even amid chaos. One of the most significant legal efforts involved handling property disputes. With deeds and records destroyed, countless residents faced uncertainty about land ownership. The city established special commissions to review claims, verify boundaries, and mediate conflicts. Surveyors redrew maps, and clerks created new property ledgers. This massive undertaking helped stabilize the real estate market and reassured citizens that their investments and futures were secure. Insurance companies played a major role in restoring public trust. Faced with unprecedented claims, many insurers initially resisted payouts, citing technicalities or disputing values. Public outrage grew quickly, and newspapers condemned companies that delayed compensation. Eventually, industry leaders recognized that failing to support policyholders would destroy their credibility. As insurers began issuing payments, rebuilding accelerated dramatically, and confidence in financial institutions improved. Still, the crisis prompted reforms in the insurance industry, including stricter standards for building valuations and more comprehensive policy structures. The fire also inspired a broader cultural shift toward civic responsibility. Citizens' organizations, volunteer groups, and local clubs took active roles in monitoring public safety, lobbying for infrastructure improvements, and demanding transparency from elected officials. This grassroots push for accountability helped strengthen democratic participation and encouraged leaders to prioritize the public good over private gain. By the end of the decade, Chicago's institutions, police, courts, government offices, fire departments, and civic organizations, had not only recovered, but had grown stronger. Through collaboration, reform, and persistent effort, the city managed to rebuild both its skyline and its civic integrity. Public trust, though shaken, had begun to return. Not because Chicago had become perfect, but because its people had demonstrated extraordinary resilience, initiative, and belief in the shared project of rebuilding a better city. In the years following the Great Chicago Fire, one of the city's most urgent and transformative challenges involved rebuilding and modernizing its transportation systems. Before the fire, Chicago's streets had already been notoriously uneven, congested, and often poorly maintained. Wooden sidewalks creaked underfoot, wagon wheels became stuck in mud during rains, and drainage systems frequently overflowed, creating unhealthy conditions in crowded neighborhoods. The fire destroyed a vast portion of this infrastructure, but in doing so, it also cleared the way for new ideas. What had once been a cumbersome, uneven patchwork of roadways now became an open canvas on which engineers and city planners could imagine a more efficient and forward-thinking system of movement. City leaders realized early that rebuilding streets exactly as they had been would be a wasted opportunity. Chicago needed wider avenues, better drainage, more durable materials, and upgraded transit routes that could accommodate both the daily flow of residents and a massive economic activity generated by the city's booming industries. Engineers proposed replacing wooden sidewalks with stone or concrete, arguing that safer, fireproof pathways could reduce accidents and prevent the rapid spread of fire in future emergencies. Although the shift would take years to fully implement, the first post-fire sidewalks, simple stone slabs, became visible symbols of Chicago's desire to evolve beyond its earlier vulnerabilities. Transportation reform extended beyond streets and sidewalks. The streetcar system, which had been gradually expanding before the fire, now became central to discussions about the city's future. The destroyed districts required new lines, new routes, and updated rolling stock. Investors purchased fresh horse-drawn streetcars, while entrepreneurs tested cable-driven systems that promised greater reliability. These innovations marked the beginning of a transition that would eventually lead to electric streetcars and, decades later, the elevated trains that became iconic symbols of Chicago. The fire had created not only a logistical necessity, but an intellectual spark, encouraging transportation companies to reimagine what urban mobility could be. Bridges also played a critical role in the city's reconstruction. The Chicago River, which had once been both a lifeline and an obstacle, required improved crossings to support a rapidly expanding population. Many bridges have been destroyed or damaged during the fire, and engineers seized the opportunity to build stronger, more efficient structures. Drawbridges with improved mechanisms allowed ships to pass while reducing delays for wagons and foot traffic. These innovations supported Chicago's growth as a port city and reinforced its role as a central hub for national trade. As rebuilding progressed, the city also invested in new grading and drainage projects. The fire had exposed how quickly flames spread along the city's wooden roadways and how poorly drainage systems functioned under stress. Urban planners insisted on better sewers, more consistent street elevations, and improved water flow. This led to extensive excavation and construction in the years that followed. Miles of new sewer lines, underground infrastructure, and raised street surfaces that would support the city's future growth. These projects required enormous financial investment, but residents understood that improving infrastructure was essential if Chicago hoped to become a safe and modern city. Despite the progress, challenges persisted. Property owners sometimes resisted widening streets, fearing loss of land. Streetcar companies argued about routes and fares. Some neighborhoods complained of neglect, while wealthier districts demanded priority. Yet the overall momentum was undeniable. Chicago was transforming into a city of movement, faster, safer, and more interconnected than ever before. The reinvention of its streets, transit systems, and urban planning laid the foundation for the metropolis Chicago would soon become, a city defined by innovation, ambition, and tireless motion. If any single system defined the vulnerability of pre-fire Chicago, it was the city's water and sewage infrastructure. Narrow water mains, limited hydrants, and an overstressed pumping station had crippled the firefighting effort and contributed significantly to the disaster spread. In the wake of the fire, engineers and public health experts argued that rebuilding Chicago meant redefining how a modern city supplied clean water, processed waste, and protected its citizens from both fire and disease. These were not merely technical concerns. They were existential questions for a city determined never to face such devastation again. The heart of Chicago's water system, the Pine Street pumping station, had miraculously survived the fire despite being surrounded by destruction. This survival was symbolic and practical. It became the anchor for sweeping reforms. Engineers examined its weaknesses, outdated pipes, insufficient pressure, and an over-reliance on limited intake lines extending into Lake Michigan. The fire demonstrated how easily a single point of failure could cripple the entire city. Thus began an ambitious and long-term plan to expand mains, add redundancy, and dramatically increase the number of hydrants. Construction crews dug through rubble and mud, laying thicker iron pipes beneath newly graded streets. These upgrades allowed water to reach more neighborhoods quickly and at higher pressures, significantly strengthening fire defense. Parallel to water expansion was the urgent need for sewage reform. Chicago had long struggled with waste disposal, relying on a system that emptied into the Chicago River, a river that flowed into Lake Michigan, the city's primary drinking water source. This created a cycle of contamination that public health officials increasingly recognized as dangerous. Diseases such as cholera, typhoid, and dysentery were common threats. After the fire, with thousands living in makeshift shelters and sanitary conditions deteriorating, improving sewage infrastructure became more than an engineering necessity. It became an ethical imperative. City leaders sought bold solutions. They approved extensions of the sewer network and introduced plans to deepen, widen, and modernize existing lines. An even more ambitious idea began circulating in engineering circles, reversing the flow of the Chicago River so that wastewater would flow away from Lake Michigan rather than into it. Although the full project would not be completed until the 20th century, its conceptual foundation emerged directly from the conversation sparked during the post-fire rebuilding. The city began adopting a forward-thinking engineering philosophy, one that treated public health as a component of urban infrastructure rather than a separate social issue. To support these improvements, Chicago invested heavily in training and hiring professional engineers. This represented a departure from earlier practices, where political appointees with little technical knowledge oversaw critical public works. The shift marked an important victory for reformers who demanded competence and expertise in municipal government. Engineers conducted detailed surveys, created standardized plans, and insisted on rigorous inspections. They documented water pressure tests, measured sewage flow rates, and recommended long-term strategies to accommodate the city's explosive population growth. Residents welcomed many of these changes, especially as cleaner water and better drainage improved hygiene in crowded neighborhoods. However, the projects were expensive, leading to debates over taxes and municipal debt. Some argued that the city should prioritize immediate housing needs instead of investing in unseen underground systems. Others countered that without modern infrastructure, Chicago would face future disasters, fires, floods, and disease outbreaks that could undermine rebuilding efforts. In the end, a combination of public support, political determination, and engineering vision allowed the city to press forward with unprecedented improvements. By the end of the decade, Chicago's water and sewage systems were vastly more advanced than before the fire. Hydrants lined rebuilt streets, water mains extended into new districts, and drainage systems began reducing stagnant pools and flooded basements. Although many challenges remained, the city had taken decisive steps towards safeguarding public health and preventing future catastrophes. These projects not only restored essential services, they laid the technical foundation that would enable Chicago to grow into a global metropolis known for its infrastructure and engineering brilliance. As the physical rebuilding of Chicago accelerated, another less visible but equally transformative process unfolded: the modernization of the city's technological and communication systems. Before the fire, Chicago had already begun developing an impressive network of telegraph lines, printing presses, and industrial machinery. However, the disaster destroyed much of this infrastructure, reducing miles of telegraph wire to melted tangles and flattening the city's communication hubs. In the fire's aftermath, Chicago's business leaders, inventors, engineers, and entrepreneurs seized the opportunity to rebuild these systems not simply as replacements, but as foundations for a modern industrial powerhouse. Telegraph companies were among the first to respond. These firms understood that rapid communication was essential for coordinating relief efforts, rebuilding trade connections, and restoring public confidence. Crews worked tirelessly to restring lines, repair poles, and re-establish communication links with major cities across the nation. Within weeks, Chicago was once again connected to the National Telegraph Network. But the companies didn't stop at restoration, they expanded. Additional lines were installed, larger relay offices were constructed, and upgraded equipment improved transmission speed and reliability. This allowed businesses to send orders, confirm shipments, and conduct negotiations with unprecedented efficiency. Newspapers also played a crucial role in the city's technological rebirth. Despite losing their buildings, presses, and archives, Chicago's major papers, most notably the Tribune and the Times, re-established operations with stunning speed. Borrowing equipment, leasing temporary spaces, and working around the clock, journalists and printers resumed publication within days of the fire. Their early issues were thin, hastily printed, and sometimes uneven in quality, but they carried critical information: lists of missing persons, locations of relief centers, descriptions of rebuilding plans, and announcements of donated supplies. Over time, newspapers upgraded their presses to more advanced, faster models, helping to elevate Chicago into one of the premier printing centers in the world. Industry, too, underwent a technological awakening. Factories rebuilt with stronger materials and installed updated machinery. Blacksmiths, machinists, and engineers seized upon the opportunity to redesign equipment that had previously been difficult to replace. Manufacturers invested in steam-powered tools, precision instruments, and improved conveyor systems, ushering Chicago into a new era of mechanization. Many businesses introduced technologies that increased production speeds and reduced labor costs, helping the city regain its role as a manufacturing titan in the Midwest. The fire also accelerated the adoption of modern office technologies. Businesses that lost filing systems and equipment had the chance to replace them with improved designs. Fireproof safes, standardized filing cabinets, and early forms of office organization that would later influence national corporate practices. Some insurance offices experimented with new duplicating methods for paperwork, anticipating innovations that would later become standard in administrative work. Perhaps most importantly, the fire cultivated a mindset of innovation. Chicagoans came to believe that technology was not a luxury, but a necessity, an essential tool for protecting the city from future dangers and empowering its economic growth. This cultural shift set the stage for Chicago's emergence as a center of engineering education, industrial research, and architectural experimentation. Universities expanded their programs in science and engineering. Civic leaders promoted technological exhibitions, and inventors found eager investors willing to support experimental ideas. By the late 1870s, Chicago was not only rebuilt, it was technologically transformed. Communication flowed faster, industries operated more efficiently, and the city's economy was infused with a spirit of innovation and confidence. The fire had destroyed the old Chicago, but in its place rose a new kind of metropolis, one that embraced technology as the backbone of its future and set the stage for the city's ascent as one of the great industrial powers of the United States. In the years following the Great Chicago Fire, one of the most remarkable aspects of the city's transformation was not simply the rebuilding of streets, buildings, and businesses, but the rebuilding of population itself. Chicago was already a city shaped by immigration before 1871, with Irish, German, Scandinavian, and Central European communities forming vibrant, distinct neighborhoods. But after the fire, the city experienced an even more dramatic influx of newcomers. Despite the destruction, or perhaps because of it, Chicago became a magnet for those seeking opportunity, safety, and a fresh start. This surge of immigration played a crucial role in the city's rapid rebirth. For many immigrants, the fire created an unexpected opening. While thousands of Chicagoans fled or relocated temporarily, new arrivals saw opportunity where others saw only ruin. The demand for labor skyrocketed as rebuilding required workers in nearly every field. Carpenters, masons, blacksmiths, roofers, railway workers, dock laborers, teamsters, plasterers, and domestic servants. Countless immigrants from Germany, Sweden, Norway, Poland, Lithuania, Bohemia, and Italy poured into the city, often arriving with little more than a few tools and the hope that hard work could secure a better future. Steamships arriving in New York and Boston carried men and women who soon boarded trains to the Midwest. drawn by newspaper reports that Chicago was hiring anyone willing to work. These immigrants, many of whom had endured poverty or political turmoil in Europe, were both resilient and adaptable. They quickly formed tight-knit communities that mirrored their homelands. German immigrants revived the cultural institutions they had brought decades earlier: beer halls, singing societies, and social clubs. Swedish and Norwegian families created their own churches, newspapers, and benevolent societies. Eastern European Jews established neighborhoods filled with Yiddish speech, kosher bakeries, and mutual aid societies that helped newcomers navigate life in a foreign land. Poles organized Catholic parishes that served as both religious and cultural centers, allowing them to preserve their traditions even as they integrated into urban life. Housing, however, posed enormous challenges. Many immigrant families initially settled in hastily built shantytowns near the fire zone. These makeshift neighborhoods were constructed quickly, often with leftover lumber or scrap materials, and lacked proper sanitation. Streets flooded easily, fires broke out frequently, and overcrowding became a constant hazard. Yet these neighborhoods also fostered extraordinary solidarity. Families shared meals, cared for each other's children, and formed informal networks of support that helped newcomers adjust. Even in the bleakest conditions, immigrants found ways to infuse their surroundings with music, food, rituals, and cultural celebrations that reminded them of home. As Chicago expanded into new districts, immigrant communities moved with it. The city's map gradually transformed into a mosaic of cultural enclaves, each contributing unique traditions, cuisines, languages, and labor practices. This diversity became one of Chicago's defining strengths. While cultural boundaries sometimes led to misunderstandings or tensions, the constant interaction among different groups fostered a cosmopolitan atmosphere. Immigrants brought not only labor, but also skills, craftsmanship, agricultural knowledge, mechanical expertise, and entrepreneurial ambition. They opened businesses, built churches, established theaters, and created newspapers in their native languages. The city's political landscape also shifted as immigrant populations grew. Many communities began electing aldermen and influencing local elections. Their votes mattered, and political machines were quick to court them. While this sometimes led to exploitation, it also gave immigrants a voice in shaping city policy. They pushed for better schools, improved sanitation, and more equitable labor practices. By the late 1870s, Chicago had become one of the most ethnically diverse cities in the United States. Its immigrant communities were central not only to rebuilding the city, but to redefining its identity. The fire had cleared physical space, but it had also created social and economic openings that newcomers filled with energy, resilience, and cultural vibrancy. In many ways, the rise of post-fire Chicago was not just a story of construction and innovation. It was a story of human migration, hope, and the forging of a new American urban identity. As Chicago transformed from a smoldering ruin into a bustling industrial center, its labor force grew not only in size, but in consciousness. The intense demands of rebuilding the city created an economy hungry for workers, but it also exposed the harsh realities faced by laborers: long hours, dangerous conditions, low wages, and little protection against exploitation. These conditions set the stage for the emergence of one of the most vibrant and influential labor movements in American history. Immediately after the fire, workers were in high demand. Contractors offered jobs on the spot to anyone who could swing a hammer or carry bricks. But wages were inconsistent and safety precautions were minimal. Men climbed unstable scaffolding, waded through debris, inhaled clouds of dust, and labored in freezing winter winds with little clothing or shelter. Child labor was common. Boys as young as 10 hauled stones or carried water to work crews. Women, often widowed or supporting displaced families, found work washing laundry, sewing garments, and taking in boarders. Despite their critical contributions, they were paid significantly less than men. These hardships sparked conversations that gradually evolved into organized action. Workers gathered in saloons, boarding houses, and community halls to discuss grievances. They compared wages, shared stories of injuries, and debated strategies for demanding better treatment. Many immigrants brought with them traditions of labor organization from Europe. German workers with socialist ideas, Scandinavian workers with cooperative traditions, and Irish laborers with a long history of collective resistance. These cultural influences blended into a growing belief that workers deserved a voice. By the mid-1870s, formal unions began to take shape across Chicago. Carpenters, bricklayers, machinists, and other trades formed associations to negotiate wages and working conditions. The Knights of Labor, one of the nation's earliest labor organizations, gained significant influence in Chicago by promoting unity across trades. They emphasized education, moral reform, and the belief that laborers should have a say in economic decisions that affected their lives. Their membership included men and women, skilled and unskilled workers, native-born Americans, and immigrants alike. Yet the road to labor rights was not smooth. Many employers viewed unions as threats to profit and control. They blacklisted workers who attempted to organize, hired private detectives to spy on union meetings, and called police to break strikes. These conflicts sometimes turned violent, with workers beaten, arrested, or fired for demanding fair treatment. Still, the labor movement persisted, fueled by the shared experience of hardship during Chicago's rebuilding. The fire had created a city where physical labor was essential to survival. Workers recognized their importance and demanded respect commensurate with their contributions. Strikes became more common, such as those among railroad workers, lumberyard laborers, and construction crews. Some strikes succeeded, leading to wage increases or shorter workdays. Others failed, but they strengthened solidarity among workers and increased public awareness of labor issues. The labor movement also intersected with politics. Reform candidates sought support from unions and pledged to address workplace injustices. Some won elections, bringing labor concerns into city council debates. Activists published pamphlets, gave speeches in public squares, and encouraged workers to organize across ethnic and occupational lines. The seeds planted in these early years would eventually grow into some of Chicago's most consequential labor battles, including the Haymarket Affair of 1886, a pivotal event in American labor history. Though that event occurred well after the fire, its roots lay firmly in the post-1871 era, when workers first began to realize their collective power and the need to challenge the systems that exploited them. Through struggle, solidarity, and sacrifice, Chicago's workers transformed the city not just physically, but socially and politically. Their contributions ensured that the story of Chicago's rise was not only about buildings and businesses, but also about the human effort that made every brick, beam, and rail possible. Although often overlooked in traditional histories, women played an extraordinary and indispensable role in the rebuilding of Chicago after the fire. Their contributions occurred across every dimension of civic life: domestic, economic, social, and political. The fire had left tens of thousands of families without homes, income, or stability. Women, many of whom lost husbands, children, and property, assumed responsibilities that society had previously discouraged them from taking on. The crisis upended traditional gender roles, and in doing so, opened the door for new forms of leadership and social influence that would shape Chicago's future. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, women were at the heart of relief efforts. They staffed distribution centers, organized charity drives, cooked meals for the displaced, and established temporary kitchens in makeshift shelters. Women coordinated clothing collections, sewed garments for families who had escaped with nothing, and volunteered tirelessly at medical stations. These acts were not merely charitable. They represented an emerging form of civic engagement through which women gained public visibility and authority. Their efforts demonstrated that women were essential not just in private households, but in the functioning of the entire city. And that brings us to the end of today's deep journey through the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, a story not only of destruction, but of transformation, innovation, and the unbreakable power of human resilience. Today, you learned how. A single spark reduced an entire metropolis to ashes. Families, immigrants, and workers found strength in unity and rebuilt their lives. Architects, engineers, and planners reinvented the city with bold new ideas. Chicago's skyline changed forever, eventually giving birth to the modern skyscraper. Public health, safety, politics, labor rights, and social reforms evolved because of the fire. The city transformed from a burned ruin into a global powerhouse, admired around the world. The moral of this history? Even the greatest tragedies can spark the greatest transformations. Chicago taught the world that from devastation can come innovation, from ashes can come ambition, and from suffering can come strength. If one city can rise from nothing to become a symbol of progress, then anyone, anywhere, can rise from their darkest moments too. Thank you for joining me on this long and powerful journey through time. If you enjoyed this episode, if it moved you, inspired you, or taught you something new, then I invite you to return again. Because here on History Teller YT, we bring history to life, one story at a time. There are many more untold stories waiting, of empires built and broken, of forgotten heroes, of wars, inventions, revolutions, mysteries, and miracles. And I'll be right here to guide you through them. Until next time, stay curious, stay inspired, and remember, history is not just the past. It is the fire that shapes our future. This is History Teller YT, signing off.